Hello and welcome. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into history, take a moment to settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your surroundings fade into the background. Wherever you are right now, pause just briefly. Tell us quietly, to yourself, where are you watching from? What time is it there? And if you could choose any topic for a future story to drift off to sleep with, what would that be? You don't have to say it aloud. Just think it softly, and let that thought gently float away into the quiet space around you. Tonight, we're about to gently travel back through time, deep into the shadows of history. As your eyes become heavier and your breathing slows, I'll guide you softly into a place and time far from your own. You'll drift effortlessly into the medieval era, a time filled with castles and knights, humble villages and vast, rolling fields. Yet behind the romantic tales and picturesque castles was a far grimmer reality, one that often remains hidden. Tonight, we'll explore some of the most brutal, difficult, and unforgiving jobs that ordinary people once endured quietly, day after day, beneath the watchful gaze of history. Imagine yourself now slowly slipping back into that distant past. Feel your mind gently drifting to the small villages and bustling towns of medieval Europe. Imagine the scent of smoke lingering in the cool night air, mixed faintly with the dampness of freshly tilled earth. Hear the soft creak of wooden carts moving along muddy roads, the hushed murmurs of villagers preparing for the coming day, and the distant bell from a stone-built church softly marking the passing of the hours. Here, life moved slowly, and survival was never certain. Jobs were passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, tasks that required skill, strength, and resilience beyond anything familiar to us today. Among these, certain professions stood out as particularly harsh, physically demanding, and often quite gruesome. One such job was that of the tanner. Perhaps as you lie comfortably, wrapped warmly beneath your blankets, you can imagine the tanner, waking up before dawn, already anticipating the day ahead with quiet resignation. The tanner's life revolved entirely around transforming animal hides into leather, a process necessary yet dreaded by all involved. As morning gently breaks, the tanner steps quietly from his humble dwelling. He walks slowly toward the tanning pits, which are dug deeply into the ground near the edge of the village, kept at a respectful distance due to their foul smell. You might even catch a faint hint of that pungent aroma lingering on the air as you drift deeper into sleep. The tanner begins by carefully removing hair, flesh, and fat from the animal hides, usually cattle, sheep, or goats. His tools are primitive, heavy, and dull from use. He dips his hands into large vats filled with water mixed with lime, a corrosive solution that loosens hair but also burns the skin on his fingers and palms. You can sense the slow, patient rhythm of his work, the scraping, soaking, and rinsing, repeated over and over, day after day. The smell was overpowering. Villagers would often avoid crossing paths with the tanner, whose clothing permanently bore the marks of his trade, stained, pungent, and stiffened by years of repeated soaking. Yet, despite the brutal conditions, his work was essential. Leather was crucial for making shoes, saddles, armor, belts, and countless everyday items necessary for life in medieval times. But the tanner was not alone in facing brutal daily routines. Let your thoughts gently drift now to another figure equally essential yet quietly suffering behind the scenes, the fuller. Perhaps you've never heard this term before. Let it gently rest in your mind, something new yet unobtrusive, softly fading as sleep draws closer. The fuller's task was to cleanse and thicken woolen cloth, preparing it for tailors to create garments. For the villagers, imagine him working methodically, standing knee-deep in large wooden vats filled with water and human urine, a substance valued for its ammonia content. The ammonia helped to remove impurities and grease from the wool, but it also created a harsh environment in which the fuller spent his days. Visualize now, with sleepy eyes, this worker gently and rhythmically stamping his bare feet upon thick woolen cloth submerged in these pungent solutions, hour after hour. His feet would become sore, skin raw and irritated, yet he continued silently, knowing that every painful step contributed to the survival of his community. The work was physically taxing, repetitive, and unpleasant. It left the fuller perpetually damp, cold, and tired. The ammonia fumes irritated his eyes and lungs, yet day after day he returned to his duties, driven by quiet necessity rather than choice. Villagers knew the value of his efforts, but often kept their distance, grateful yet uncomfortable around. The lingering odor that followed him everywhere he went. Now gently shift your imagination toward another quiet, difficult figure, one who endured the heavy weight of history's demands, the gong farmer. Despite the curious name, a gong farmer did not work with crops or animals. Instead, he performed one of the least desired yet most essential jobs in medieval towns and castles. Every night, as townspeople closed their doors and retired quietly to sleep, the gong farmer began his rounds. Imagine him calmly carrying his buckets and carts through narrow streets cloaked in darkness. His role was to empty privies and cesspits, collecting human waste that accumulated during the day, not working only under cover of darkness, to spare townspeople the unpleasant sight and smell. The gong farmer moved slowly and methodically, scooping waste into large containers. This brutal, degrading task was performed quietly, invisibly often in near total darkness. Yet, without him, medieval towns would quickly become overwhelmed with disease and decay. Despite performing such vital work, gong farmers were ostracized, required to live on the outskirts of towns, away from regular society. Even now, you might gently sense the isolation and quiet dignity of such a person, laboring tirelessly in the dark, unseen and unthanked. Yet another harsh occupation that history quietly acknowledges was that of the executioner. While you breathe, calmly and slowly, imagine briefly the quiet heaviness borne by such a person. The medieval executioner performed grim, lonely work, carrying out punishments prescribed by law and society. Contrary to common assumptions, executioners were not celebrated figures. They were social pariahs, isolated and feared. Imagine him, sitting quietly alone, preparing his tools, ropes, axes, or blades, each carefully maintained. His work, though brutal, required a steady hand and a calm demeanor. Executioners, paradoxically, were often respected for their skill, yet avoided by townsfolk who feared being tainted by association. Feel gently the emotional weight borne by such individuals, necessary yet feared, isolated despite their importance. Tonight, as your mind softly drifts toward sleep, you can perhaps feel a quiet sense of gratitude, not merely for being born in gentler times, but also for those who lived quietly in the shadows of history, performing harsh tasks that allowed society to thrive. Every one of these brutal jobs, tanners, foolers, gong farmers, executioners, served a necessary role. They quietly carried the heavy burdens of survival, bearing scars both physical and emotional, rarely acknowledged yet profoundly essential. The medieval world rarely offered dignity to the lower rungs of its workforce, and yet the structure of society rested entirely on their unseen, unthanked labor. We've walked through alleys, woods, docks, and fields already, but we have not yet descended below. Beneath the surface of cities like London or Paris, another class of workers moved quietly, largely in darkness, the sewermen, also called nightmen. In later centuries, their tasks were as essential as they were revolting. Unlike the gong farmers who carried waste away from homes, these men went deeper, into tunnels, cisterns, overflow pits. Their job was to physically descend into the city's limited and crude sewage systems to clear blockages and dig out waste. By hand, the passages they entered were narrow, often collapsing and filled with methane and rot. Their torches burned low, if they burned at all. The air was sometimes too thick, too wet, too foul to even keep aflame. But they still climbed down. They scraped human waste into buckets, shoveled congealed filth into baskets, dug with metal spades or sometimes just their gloved hands. In some cities, these tunnels flooded during storms or backed up from improper drainage. Many sewer workers were found drowned, not in clean water, but in layers of thick, choking sludge. Helmets didn't exist. Breathing masks hadn't been imagined. They worked in silence, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone. But no one saw them. Come or go. In the daytime, they tried to clean themselves. But no matter how hard they scrubbed, the smell followed. Their children were often shunned in schools, their wives pitied. Some towns refused to allow them in certain public spaces. And yet, had they stopped working even for a week, disease would have surged through the streets like wildfire. Dysentery, cholera, typhus, all waited silently in the pipes, needing only a moment of neglect to awaken Dot above the ground. A very different kind of worker faced a different kind of suffering, one tied not to waste, but to pain itself. Let's turn now toward the grim profession of the tooth-drawer. There were no dentists in medieval Europe as we know them today. Tooth decay, infections, and abscesses were common, especially with diets heavy in bread and lacking in vitamins. When the pain became unbearable, people would seek out the traveling tooth-drawer, man who carried with him a set of crude iron tools and an even cruder understanding of human anatomy. He worked in public squares, markets, or sometimes inside taverns. His services were swift and brutal. There were no numbing agents, no antiseptics, no sterilization. The sufferer sat sometimes tied to a chair, sometimes held by relatives, and opened their mouth wide. The tooth-drawer would pry, twist, wrench, and pull, often breaking the tooth and gum together. People screamed, some fainted. A few died from infection days later. But in that moment, once the tooth was out, the relief was so intense it was often called holy. Ironically, the job itself was not pain-free. The tooth-drawer risked infection from patient blood. He often dislocated his own shoulder from repeated yanking. His tools, if not maintained, could snap and injure him. And if he failed too many times or killed a high-born client, he could be run out of town or beaten. Yet towns needed him. Villagers lined up. Children watched, learning both dread and expectation. A different pain, of a different kind, haunted those tasked with dealing not with the living, but the recently dead. The body washer or sin eater was another grim figure. In many rural communities, when someone passed, it became essential to prepare the body before burial. This task did not fall to clergy in most cases. It fell to women, widows, or outcast figures who were paid to clean, wrap, and sometimes ritually cleanse the body of its sins. The washer would enter the home where death had occurred often. A cramped space, warm and thick, with the smell of illness, and would begin her work. She had to undress the body, wash the skin, plug the orifices to prevent leakage, comb the hair, close the eyelids and mouth. All of this was done by hand. There were no gloves. If the body had been ill for long, it may have already begun to change. Rigor mortis, swelling, bleeding, sores. The washer saw all of it. She bore it silently. Sometimes she would be asked to sit beside the body for the night to keep away spirits or animals. Sometimes she would be paid with bread and broth, but mostly she was not thanked. The family would weep and then forget. Her if she also served as a sin eater, a tradition more common in some remote parts. She would be asked to eat a piece of bread and drink ale over the corpse. Symbolically, she was taking in the sins of the dead removing them so the soul might travel on peacefully. It was a deeply spiritual task, and one that ensured no one wanted to share meals with her afterward. And yet, every time someone died, she was called again. Let us step away from this quiet, candlelit room and return to the open air, toward the fields now. But not to farmers. To the lime quarrymen. Limestone was essential for construction. Churches, castles, bridges all required it. But to gather, it meant working in the quarries, often deep and unstable, where the stone walls echoed with every hammer's strike. Quarrymen used metal spikes and heavy mallets to split great sheets of stone. They worked in the cold, in the wet, with dust filling their lungs and eyes. When it rained, the quarry turned to slick mud. When it snowed, tools became brittle and hands bled from cold. The most brutal aspect was the danger. Rockfalls were common. One wrong move, a misplaced wedge, a weakened ledge, and tons of stone could come crashing down. Sometimes workers were crushed outright. Other times, they were pinned, only partially buried. And help was rarely immediate. Quarrymen rarely lived. Past middle age, their backs curved, their fingers curled, their breath grew shallow and wheezy. But they built the bones of Europe, one block at a time. Now we move inland again, not to the fields or forests, but to the center of spectacle, to the bear baiter, and the men who handled performing or fighting animals. The bear baiting was a gruesome form of entertainment in medieval and early modern Europe. In circular arenas, bears were chained and forced to fight dogs for public amusement. The animals howled. The crowd cheered. Bets were placed. Ale was spilled. It was sport and savagery, but someone had to care for the animals, feed them, chain them, heal them between fights if they survived. This was the job of the handler, often a desperate man. Sometimes a criminal spared execution in return for managing the beasts. He lived beside cages, slept within earshot of growls. He cleaned the blood, set broken limbs, pulled dogs' teeth from bare hides. Bears were unpredictable. Angry, they bit, they swiped. Some killed their handlers outright. The work was not just brutal, it was morally scarring. Many handlers drank themselves into stupors between matches. Others stopped speaking altogether. When the crowd left, the roars still echoed, but no one cheered for him. Across all regions of medieval Europe, from the cold coasts of Scandinavia to the sun-bleached fields of southern Spain, there existed a job so feared, so universally reviled, that even hardened criminals sometimes turned it down. It was the work of the rat catcher. In towns where filth piled high, where waste trickled through streets in open ditches and rotting food gathered flies. By the thousands, rats thrived. They lived in walls, in barns, under floorboards, in city gates, behind market stalls. And with them came fleas. And with fleas came plague, while townspeople avoided these infestations, turning a blind eye until it was too late. There was one person tasked with facing them head on, the rat catcher. He didn't wear armor or carry a sword. His tools were crude traps, nets, sacks, small clubs, and sometimes poison, though that was expensive and unpredictable. Most of the time, it was simply him versus them. A cellar full of movement, a hayloft alive with noise, a kitchen overrun. He crouched in dark corners. He waited, still as stone, until he heard the first scratch. Then the chase began. He was bitten often, scratched, sometimes badly. Infection was a constant threat. He smelled of filth. His clothing often had to be burned. But towns needed him, especially during outbreaks. If plague was suspected, he was among the first called not to treat the sick, but to chase what caused it. In some areas, he also served as the village's unofficial pest expert, tasked with dealing not only with rats, but snakes, wild dogs, wasp nests, diseased birds, and bats. He was, in every sense, the barrier between filth and flame. And he was never thanked. Rat catchers often lived alone, sometimes with a dog, rarely with a family. The work followed them. The smell, the sores, the risk. But without them, cities would have drowned in vermin and died in silence. Not far from the rats, another profession worked among sickness and silence: the hospital attendant. Today, we think of hospitals as clean places filled with white coats, antiseptics, machines that beep softly. But in the medieval world, hospitals were far from safe. They were often overcrowded, underfunded, and filled with the dying rather than the healing. The hospital attendant, usually a monk or a poor woman from the town, was responsible for everything. She changed soiled linens. She fed patients who could no longer lift a spoon. She washed infected wounds with bare hands. She swept floors slippery with bodily fluids. She comforted the screaming and carried away the silent. There were no gloves, no masks, no antibiotics, no training. She learned as she went, trial by fire, or rather by blood. The hardest task was burial. In small infirmaries, if a patient died during the night, it was often the attendant who had to prepare the body, clean the bed, and make space for another soul before sunrise. Many attendants became infected themselves. Tuberculosis, pox, fevers. Some lasted months. A few only days. The church praised their work as holy, but rarely protected them. And when outbreaks came, real outbreaks, their fate was sealed first. Still, they returned, day after day, whispering prayers as they worked. Not for themselves, for the ones left behind. And then there were the resurrection men. In the late medieval and early modern periods, particularly near the end of the era, the need for cadavers for medical study began to rise. Universities demanded real bodies for dissection. The church hesitated. Families refused. But science pressed on. So, under cover of darkness, certain men, often former criminals, climbed into graveyards with shovels and carts and dug up the recently buried. The fresher the corpse, the better the pay. They worked fast, usually in pairs. One dug, one kept watch. They removed rings, shoes, jewelry, anything that might give them away. Then, using hooks or sheets, they lifted the body from the grave and placed it carefully in a sack. They didn't steal the coffin, just the person inside. In many towns, this was a capital crime. If caught, resurrection men could be flogged, branded, or executed. Some were hunted like murderers. They rarely spoke of what they did. Most used false names. And yet, their work helped early doctors learn the structure of the body, the location of organs, the nature of disease. They walked the line between grave robbers and accidental pioneers of anatomy. Further north, in colder regions, a different breed of worker battled the harshness of nature. Directly, the peat cutter. Peat, a dense form of mossy earth, was used for heating. It burned slow and steady, especially in lands where wood was scarce. But gathering peat was a brutal task. Peat bogs were treacherous, wet, acidic, and sometimes swallowing. The land could collapse underfoot. Boots would fill with freezing water. Hands would go numb within minutes. Cutter families lived near bogs and shacks, entire generations surviving on nothing but peat sales. Children worked too, stacking blocks, turning them to dry. The air was damp year-round. Coughs never left. Rheumatism and frostbite were common by the age of 30. Every block of peat was a day's work. No one thanked them. But every fire lit in a stone house owed its warmth to a man knee-deep in freezing mud. In warmer regions, along the Mediterranean coasts and dry inland plains, another suffering figure trudged behind caravans and ox carts: the salt miner. Salt was essential. It preserved meat. It seasoned food. It allowed armies to travel. But harvesting it was agonizing in salt flats. Workers bent beneath the sun for hours, raking the crusty ground and gathering crystals into heaps. The glare off the white salt burned the eyes. Skin cracked and bled. Lips blistered. Water was precious, but scarce. Many collapsed. In salt mines, conditions were even worse. The air was dry and choking. The tunnels narrow. The salt dust got into every wound, every cut, every sore. It stung like fire and never stopped. Breathing it damaged the lungs. Swallowing it ruined the stomach. Miners aged quickly. Bones weakened. Teeth fell out. But salt was worth more than gold in many towns. It was called white gold. And for every pinch that reached a noble table, someone else had paid in blood and breath. From salt to iron, from filth to fire, the brutality of medieval labor knew no borders. Some jobs demanded your back, others your health, some your soul, but all were essential. The world as it was, the castles, the manuscripts, the music and murals, the myths and the monarchs stood upon the broken bodies of the workers no one remembers. The ones who rose before dawn, who didn't come home clean, who worked in silence, in darkness, in pain. Their names are lost, but their labor is not in the folds of medieval daily life. Some of the harshest labor was hidden in plain sight, in the kitchens, the breweries, and the sweat-filled spaces beneath castles and manor houses. While nobility feasted and clergy dined in silence, another set of workers toiled in the heat, managing dangerous ingredients, scalding liquids, and unpredictable fires. These were the scullion's kitchen boys, cook's assistants, and human. Engines behind every banquet and meal. A scullion didn't begin his day. It was simply a continuation of the one before. He slept near the hearth or in the pantry, if he was lucky. He was the first awake and the last to sleep. His hands were always raw, always damp, always smelling faintly of smoke, lard, and soap ash. His tasks were endless. Scrubbing greasy pots, with sand and water, fetching water from the well over and over again, hauling firewood into the kitchen, stirring great cauldrons of soup, where one careless move could mean a face full of boiling broth. The kitchen was not a place of refinement. It was noise and sweat and motion. Knives clattered, meat sizzled, fire roared. Scullions had to pluck birds, gut fish, livestock, grind spices, peel root vegetables by the barrel. When a great feast was underway, he could be on his feet for 20 hours or more, slipping in blood, steam, and spilled ale. He didn't eat the meals he helped prepare. He took scraps, whatever was left on the bone, or fell to the floor. Bread crusts, boiled carrots, sometimes just boiled water thickened with flour. He had no formal training, no path upward unless someone noticed him. Most were orphans or abandoned children. Some were sold into the trade, but all of them understood the rhythm of service, because stopping meant punishment, sleeping too long meant dismissal, and there was always someone more desperate waiting to take their place. From scullions in the kitchens to those managing pain in public, we now move into the medieval courtroom, not the hall where justice was declared, but the place where it was carried out. There you would find the torturer. The word alone carries weight. Today, it conjures horror. But in the medieval world, it was simply another job. Brutal, yes, but legitimized by law, ordered by judges, and overseen by local officials. Torturers weren't sadists. They were professionals trained in the art of inflicting pain without immediate death. Their work was methodical, controlled, often documented. They worked in rooms below ground or behind stone walls, with tools made from iron, rope, fire, and water. The rack, the strappado, thumb screws, iron boots, The heretic's fork. Devices created not for execution, but for confession. Or so the courts claimed. The torturer had to know anatomy. Where to press, where to cut, how to dislocate joints without breaking them entirely. He learned how long a person could scream, when to pause, and how to start again. The goal was not to kill, but to terrify others into silence. And he too paid. Price. Even those hardened by years of inflicting agony began to see things. Hear whispers in empty rooms. Drink more than they should. Speak less. Smile never. Some became religious, praying daily. Others fell into isolation. They were feared. And while they served kings and judges, they were never fully trusted. Their homes were often watched. Their children bullied. Their wives left. And when regimes changed, they were the first to be executed by their own machines. Let's leave the dungeon behind and walk upward now, out into the air, where the wind blows colder. We're now with the roof thatcher, high. Above the rest of the village, walking across beams that swayed in the breeze and cracked in the sun. Thatching was an essential medieval trade. Roofs of straw and reed protected the poor and rich alike. But installing them was a different matter. Thatchers balanced themselves dozens of feet above the ground, with nothing but rope and instinct to keep them from falling. They worked slowly, lashing tight bundles of straw, reeds, or heather to wooden frames. Each placement had to be perfect. Too loose, and the wind would rip the roof away. Too tight, and rain would pool and rot the house from above. The work was blistering in summer and treacherous in winter. Ice made every step a gamble. Wet reeds weighed twice as much and had to be carried up narrow ladders. Back injuries were common. Falls were fatal. Thatchers also endured ridicule. While their work kept homes dry, they were often blamed when something went wrong. When a roof leaked, when fire spread, when vermin nested between the layers, they had no guild protection. Few apprentices, and often they died as they lived quietly above everyone else and almost completely forgotten. Below them, another unsung trade moved in constant rhythm: the millstone laborer. Mills were the heartbeat of medieval agriculture. Grain came in, flour came out, bread followed. But before the grinding could begin, someone had to carve and maintain the enormous circular stones that did the work. These stones, sometimes 5, 6, even 7 feet wide, weighed thousands of pounds. They were cut from volcanic or granite. Rock, hand-chiseled with grooves so precise that a single misstrike could ruin a month's labor. Stonecutters worked in dust clouds, hammering and carving for days. The noise was deafening. Ear protection didn't exist. They inhaled stone powder constantly, damaging their lungs. Their hands blistered, cracked, and bled. Eyes strained. Fingers flattened. Once the stone was finished, it had to be moved. This alone was a brutal feat, using sledges, wooden rollers, and raw human strength. Many were crushed. Others lost toes or limbs under misjudged weight shifts. Then came maintenance. Every few weeks, the grooves had to be re-chiseled, cleaned, sharpened. Without millstones, there was no flour, no bread, no life. And without the laborers, there were no millstones. The next time you imagine a medieval meal, remember this. Behind every crust of bread was a man coughing dust and dragging stone in silence. We now pass from stone to flame. To the candlemaker, a trade often associated with monks, but in towns, handled by craftsmen who worked with their hands, submerged in tallow-rendered animal fat. These men, and sometimes women, spent their days boiling down slaughtered remnants, beef, lamb, pig, into soft fat, then dipping strings into it repeatedly until the candle took shape. The process was slow. The stench overwhelming. Tallow reeked. It stuck to skin, hair, and clothing. It filled the house, soaked into floors, attracted flies. The boiling process scalded hands. Burns were constant. Fumes were toxic. Oil splatters left scars. Workers' lungs wheezed. Their eyes watered. Worse still, they lived close to slaughterhouses and were sometimes blamed for illness and plague. Townsfolk avoided their homes. Children were forbidden from playing nearby. And yet candles were life. They lit churches, homes, halls, inns, and sickbeds. Every flicker of medieval light came at the price of someone's burned fingers and sleepless, sooty nights. And still, the work continued. In the world of war, glory often went to the knights, the commanders, and the kings. Their names filled the pages of chronicles, etched in stained glass and carved into stone. But behind every sword lifted on the battlefield, there were hands rough, burned, and bloodied that forged the tools of that glory. These were the blacksmiths and weaponsmiths. But more than that, the apprentices who lived in their shadows, enduring some of the most punishing conditions imaginable. Blacksmithing is often romanticized, a powerful figure before the anvil, sparks flying in rhythm with each swing of the hammer. But the truth, especially for those at the bottom of the forge's hierarchy, was far from noble. Apprentices started young, 10, 11, sometimes younger if the family was poor. They swept ashes, carried coal, pumped bellows until their arms ached, fetching iron ore from pits, cutting wood for charcoal, standing near the flames for hours, faces red, skin blistered, sweat soaking through wool and linen. The forge was deafening. Metal clanged against metal in an unrelenting rhythm. The air, stung with smoke, ash, and molten fumes. Shards of hot iron flew like insects in summer. Eyes were rarely spared. Apprentices often slept in the workshop itself. Their hands were calloused before adolescence. Their lungs weakened by constant inhalation of carbon and slag. Their backs curved, their wrists stiffened, and all of it years of labor was only to earn the right to be called a journeyman. And even then, the work didn't get easier. Weaponsmiths had to meet impossible standards. A flawed sword meant shame. A broken lance could mean death for a rider. Mistakes were punished not just by customers, but by the battlefield. The pressure crushed many. In wartime, demand for arms surged. Blacksmiths worked around the clock. Tools broke. Tempers rose. Forges overheated. Fires spread. Some burned to death in their own shops. Yet without them, armies were just men in tunics. No blades, no shields, no armor. And so they hammered on. Elsewhere, far from the fire's glow, a different, slower, and in many ways more draining job was performed, one that required endless patience, silence, and physical endurance. The scribe. Too. The modern eye, writing seems delicate, even luxurious. But in medieval monasteries and scriptoria, it was backbreaking work, tedious, repetitive, and physically exhausting. Scribes copied books by hand. Every letter, every punctuation mark, every illuminated capital took time and precision. It wasn't just writing, it was carving language into parchment. Their tools were unforgiving. Quills had to be cut and recut. Ink was temperamental. Too thick, it clotted. Too thin, it bled. Parchment wasn't smooth, was treated animal skin that buckled, tore, and warped with the seasons. Scribes sat hunched for hours, shoulders tight, necks stiff, hands cramping from the pressure of fine lettering, eyes strained under candlelight or dim daylight, and mistakes when made were sometimes scraped off with a knife and redone. But often, a single error meant redoing entire pages. In cold months, the ink froze. In warm months, sweat ruined pages. Rats chewed manuscripts. Molds grew on covers. And still they wrote, silently, patiently, endlessly. Some scribes developed early onset arthritis. Others went blind. Many never finished the works they began. dying mid-paragraph. Their efforts weren't signed. Their names weren't recorded. But they preserved centuries of knowledge, faith, and philosophy, one aching letter at a time. Outside the cloisters and forges, another group labored on the fringes of legality and morality. The dyers. Clothing wasn't thrown away in the middle. Ages. It was patched, reshaped, passed down, and often re-dyed. And dyeing cloth was an industrial-scale task involving toxic fumes, animal byproducts, and constant exposure to dangerous materials. Dyers worked with vats filled with fermented urine, lye, crushed insects, and plant extracts. To produce bright reds, blues, and purples, they used minerals like mercury, lead, and arsenic. Indigo came from fermenting indigofera leaves, a low rotting process that attracted flies and disease. Cochineal required boiling tens of thousands. Of beetles, the dyeing process involved boiling, soaking, beating, and sun-drying cloth in carefully timed rotations. The air around the dye house was thick with fumes. Stains never left the skin. Hands turned blue, red, black permanently. Many dyers suffered neurological issues from metal poisoning. Some went blind from handling alum or copper sulfate. Nearly all suffered from respiratory problems. In many towns, dyers were forced to work outside city walls because of the smell and waste runoff. They built huts near rivers, where dye vats overflowed and killed nearby vegetation. Still, bright cloth was in demand. Nobles paid handsomely for robes of crimson and gold. Royals wore deep purples. Priests wore dyed stoles. And dyers paid for that color with their health. In fields and forests. Another quiet but lethal profession endured. The lime spreader, quicklime, was used to treat soil, dispose of bodies during plague outbreaks, and sanitize latrines and animal pens. It was effective, but deadly. Quicklime reacts violently with water, including the water in human flesh. If it touched wet skin, it burned deeply. If inhaled, it could scorch the throat and lungs. Lime spreaders carried sacks of this caustic powder across farmland, often working during rain or damp seasons when the lime would stick. Dust coated their clothing, their eyes, their teeth. Gloves were rare. Face coverings were improvised. Accidents were frequent. Many had permanent lung damage by 30. Their arms bore chemical burns. Some were blinded. Others collapsed in the field, choking on a cloud of powder that ignited in their lungs. No one went near them when they worked. And yet, they made farming safer. They slowed the spread of disease. They allowed towns to bury their dead more cleanly. They disappeared like the dust they scattered unnoticed, unrecorded. Back in the heart of towns, a similar mix of usefulness and suffering existed in the life of the treadmill operator, also known as the human-powered mill worker. Before windmills and reliable water power, some mills were powered by people literally. Workers were put inside massive wooden wheels, like oversized hamster wheels, and forced to walk or climb inside for hours to power cranes, millstones, or even early construction sites. It was exhausting, repetitive, and dangerous. Walking, too, quickly could unbalance the wheel. Slipping could mean being crushed. Getting out required help, if there was any. The wheel had to move at a steady rhythm, hour after hour, regardless of the heat, cold, or pain in one's legs. Operators were sometimes shackled inside, especially prisoners or debtors. Others did it for pay meager and delayed. It was not a job that built strength, it destroyed it. Knees swelled, ankles twisted, spines curved. Some workers went mad from the monotony. The machines they powered built towers, raised bells, lifted cargo. But the people inside the wheels? They were never mentioned. Lastly, for now, let us visit the water's edge once again, where rivers met the edge of town, where refuse gathered and fish thinned, The tanners' waste handlers worked a sub-tier. Below even the tanners, tanneries produced animal hides for clothing, belts, boots, and armor. But the process created toxic waste, buckets of brain matter, rotted flesh, manure, and lye. Someone had to remove it. These handlers, often desperate men or the elderly, carried this slurry in wooden carts or leaking barrels, hauling it outside the town limits. They poured it into ditches, pits, or directly into rivers. They worked surrounded by flies. Their feet sunk into soft, foul ground. Their carts dripped onto their clothes. Children threw stones. Dogs followed. People turned away. Some towns banned them from living inside the walls. Their carts were burned in winter to stop disease. Their bodies were buried quickly, if at all. And yet leather was wealth. Every glove, every satchel, every soldier's boot. Their suffering lined the pockets of merchants. The life of a medieval city never truly stopped. Behind the clatter of hooves, the crackle of hearth fires, and the hum of trade, there was another sound, a distant clang, a low groan of effort, the thud of a hammer against earth. It came from places most people didn't look, places where blood soaked the dirt and iron bent under the weight of war. In these shadowed corners, you'd find the armor repairmen, a class of smiths and patchers who did not craft gleaming suits for lords, but instead spent their lives repairing the battered remnants of other men's survival. Their job began where others' pain ended. Bent breastplates, broken chainmail, split helms caked with dried blood. This was their raw material. Collected after battles or dragged in by mercenaries, the armor was dented, pierced, burned, or shattered. Every piece held a story most too painful to retell. Repairmen were expected to return these pieces to function, often without proper tools, using scrap iron, makeshift rivets, and brute force. They worked fast. The next campaign was always near. Their fingers were perpetually sliced by metal edges. Their backs bent under the weight of chain links. Sparks scorched their arms, and the smell of scorched flesh from fire welds and the lingering stink of death on gear that had seen combat was constant. Unlike elite smiths, they received little praise and even less pay. Their job was essential, but invisible. If they did it well, no one noticed. If they failed, someone died. In the next battle, outside the city walls, in lonely fields marked by stony ridges, there lived another kind of worker, one even more isolated. The charcoal collier. Charcoal was used for cooking, forging, smelting, brewing, even medicine. But it didn't come easily. Charcoal wasn't mined or harvested. It was made slowly, carefully, and under brutal conditions. The collier built massive piles of wood stacked in cones or domes, sealed with sod and earth. Inside, he lit a slow fire that would smolder for days, sometimes a full week. He couldn't leave. If the fire burned too fast, the wood turned to ash. Too slow, and the process failed. He lived by the fire, slept nearby, cooked over the same heat that threatened his life. Smoke filled his lungs. Soot coated his clothes and skin. His eyes stung. His food tasted of carbon. Sometimes, if a spark caught in the wind or the pile, collapsed, he died where he worked alone, buried under what he had built. Carts came to collect the finished charcoal, but the buyers never lingered. They didn't want the smoke, the smell, or the man who had made it. Charcoal heated kings' palaces, brewed monk's ale, forged swords, but no one ever invited the collier to stay for supper. Elsewhere, amid farmland and bramble, you might find a job that looked peaceful at first glance, one that dealt with beauty and fragrance. But the life of a herbalist harvester was anything but gentle. Medicinal plants were crucial to medieval life. From treating wounds to easing plague symptoms, herbs were the medicine of the day. But someone had to gather them, and gathering wasn't easy. Harsh weather, poisonous plants, and rugged terrain made the task dangerous. Some herbs grew only on cliffsides. Others thrived in bogs, where feet could vanish into muck and never return. Harvesters worked barefoot or in worn sandals. Their hands bled from thorns. They suffered from allergies, sunburns, and insect bites that sometimes turned septic. To misidentify a plant could mean poisoning the patient or oneself. Belladonna, hemlock, wolfsbane, some of the most potent remedies, were also lethal in the wrong dose, and herbalists often worked under suspicion. Healing was seen as sacred, and herbal knowledge, especially among women, was mistaken for witchcraft. Many were interrogated by church authorities. Some were punished, even executed, for possessing too much knowledge. Still, they rose early, walked miles, carried heavy satchels of damp leaves and roots, and returned to grind, boil, dry, and mix. In dark kitchens or cellars, their work saved lives. But it rarely saved them from poverty, pain, or persecution. From herbs to hides, another class of laborers worked with death in a different form. The knackers. Knackers were responsible for disposing of dead animals. When livestock died of disease, age, or injury, the carcasses could not simply be left to rot. Disease would spread. Water would be contaminated. Cities would reek dot, so the knackers came. They collected horses too old to pull carts, cows bloated from sickness, dogs struck by carts. They used chains, hooks, pulleys, anything to move the heavy bodies. The smell was overwhelming. Their tools were stained, their clothing stiff with blood and filth. The carcasses were not wasted. Bones became glue. Fat turned to tallow. Skins were sold to tanners. But first, the bodies had to be stripped, cut open, drained, dismembered. The process was brutal and often done outside in all weather. Knackers were often forbidden from living inside towns. Children mocked them. Inns turned them away. Priests refused them burial, and yet, without them, every road would be lined with decay. They turned rot into raw material. But no one looked them in the eye. Let us now move upward to rooftops and towers. Not to thatchers this time, but to a rare and more hazardous job. The STEEPLEJACK. Medieval churches and towers reached for the heavens, but they still cracked, leaked, and fell apart like everything else. To repair them, men climbed without harnesses, without modern ropes, often without safety of any kind. They built scaffolds from wood, lashed together by hand. One wrong knot and the whole structure swayed in the wind. Steeplejacks repointed. Stonework replaced tiles, patched lightning damage, repaired bells. They worked high above the ground, where one gust could end a life. Falls were common. Injuries were permanent. And because the work was so specialized, replacements were hard to find. Families sometimes passed down the trade, with fathers lifting sons up the scaffold by rope. No insurance. No parish protection. Just sky, stone, and wind. Now step away from the heights and into the gutters, literally. The mudlarkers were a later, medieval, and early modern development, but their existence reveals just how far people would go to survive. They scavenged riverbanks, especially the Thames, at low tide. What were they looking for? Anything of value: nails, bits of rope, coins, broken tools, discarded cloth. They walked through sewage, broken glass, rotting fish, and animal carcasses, barefoot, alone. The tide could come in suddenly, trapping them. Rats and dogs attacked. Cuts got infected. They wore rags and stank of the river, but if they were lucky, they might find enough to buy bread, just enough to live another day. They were ghosts by sunrise. Forgotten by sundown. Let us end this section in a place many never visited, but which, sat in the heart of every town. The public bathhouse.bathhouse weren't luxury spas. They were steamy, chaotic places where people came to scrub, gossip, negotiate, and sometimes seek less innocent company. And someone had to run them. The bathers. Assistants, often young boys or older men, worked the fires, hauled water, scrubbed benches, and drained filthy basins. They worked half-naked, soaked in sweat, sometimes beaten or fondled by unruly clients. They handled lice, cleaned vomit, scrubbed bodily fluids. They could never wash themselves clean. In outbreaks of plague, bathhouses were closed or used to. Wash the dying, and then reopened as if nothing had happened. The assistants never left. They had nowhere else to go. In the markets, people haggled over cheese and onions, wine and woven cloth. But outside the bustling stalls passed the noise of barter and the laughter of children. Stood one of the most controversial and brutal professions of the medieval world, the executioner's assistant. While the executioner himself carried the blade or tied the rope, the assistant was the one who dealt with the rest, what came before and what came after. He prepared the site, digging shallow graves, gathering sawdust to soak the blood, tying the condemned in place. He tested ropes, cleaned axes, and ensured the trapdoors wouldn't jam. If the condemned struggled, he helped restrain them. If they cried, he was the one who stuffed the cloth in their mouths. When heads were removed, he collected them. He boiled them. He tarred them. He placed them on spikes atop city gates. When bodies needed quartering, he helped saw through bone and muscle. He burned limbs, carted torsos, cleaned the block, removed stains from cobblestones, hauled remains to mass pits outside city walls, where birds and dogs lingered. It was a job without honor. He was feared like the executioner, but with none of the grim mystique. Just blood on his boots and silence in the taverns where he wasn't welcome. When he died, often young, often alone, his grave was unmarked, his name unspoken. But every public death bore his hidden fingerprints. Not far behind him, in the eyes of the church, was another kind of worker whose job brought shame, pain, and social exile. The gravedigger got not the calm, robed priest placing, a flower on consecrated ground. This was the man who dug the hole. Gravediggers worked with blunt shovels and pickaxes, not in dry soil, but often in cold mud, hard clay, or frozen earth. Their fingers cracked from the cold. Their backs stiffened from repetition. The graves were never the same width, never the same depth. Each one judged not by measurement, but by fatigue. They dug in storms, in frost. In plague years, they didn't. Stop digging at all. The worst times or outbreaks. The graveyards filled faster than the earth could hold. Bodies stacked 3, 4 deep. Gravediggers worked through the night, with torches and rags around their faces to soften the stench. Some began to hallucinate from lack of sleep and the smell of rot. They were rarely paid well. Sometimes not at all. Their work was holy in function, but unholy in perception. They were avoided like death itself. People whispered about curses, about ghosts, about what happened if a gravedigger looked you in the eye too long. But still, the earth needed moving. And they moved it. In winter months, when frozen ground made digging nearly impossible, death didn't slow down. The bodies waited, lined, in sheds or caves. By spring, the soil softened, but the smell didn't leave. Some gravediggers died in the pits themselves, fainting from exhaustion or falling into caved-in earth. And still, the bell rang. Another soul passed on, and another hole had to be made. We leave the graveyard now and follow the stone roads outward, toward the thick forests, toward the world of the woodcutter. Before coal, before oil, before electricity, the medieval world was warmed by firewood. Everything depended on it. cooking, heating, metalwork, even brewing. And so someone had to gather it, not from tidy stacks or orchards, but from deep, wild forests. Woodcutters lived hard, lonely lives. They worked from dawn until dusk, often walking for miles before even lifting an axe. They felled trees in snow, in wind, in rain. Trees didn't fall like they do in fairy tales. They cracked, twisted, tore through branches on the way down. They crushed legs, backs, arms. A single misstep meant a life ended beneath the very resource he harvested. Once the tree was down, the work began again, stripping bark, cutting limbs, splitting trunks, hauling loads with oxen or on their shoulders. Insects burrowed into their clothes. Their hands were permanently blistered, their breath always short, their joints stiff by middle age. In bad years, when trees grew scarce, they ventured further into dangerous woods, past wolves, robbers, and curses whispered by villagers. They built huts from scraps, ate dried meat, slept with axes beside their beds, and when they returned to town, no one asked about the forest. They only asked about the price of timber. Let us shift now to a profession caught between necessity and disgust. The butcher, not the clean-clothed merchant behind a stall, but the slaughterhouse butcher, the one whose boots squished when he walked, whose apron hardened from dried blood. Animals were not stunned. They were not dispatched gently. Cows bellowed as they were roped. Pigs squealed. Goats kicked. The slaughter was physical, violent, and never fully predictable. A misstep with a blade could mean injury or worse. Butchers used knives so often that many lost parts of their fingers over time. The repetitive motion of skinning, slicing, gutting, and bone sawing warped their hands. The air around them buzzed with flies. The floors were always wet. Guts had to be cleaned. Organs sorted. Heads boiled. Skin scraped. Hooves cracked open. In cold weather, their hands froze around metal. In warm, meat spoiled if not worked fast enough. Butchers were blamed for everything from bad smells to spreading disease. They were sometimes accused of harboring the devil, of working in blood too freely, but people still ate. Meat still sold. And someone had to make the cuts. In larger towns, butchers had their own quarter far from the main streets. Visitors passed. Quickly, residents lived with the sounds. Knives hitting wood, bones cracking, animals dying. Few married unless within the trade. Fewer left the trade without limp or scar. Moving from the blood-soaked floor of the slaughterhouse, we now rise. Again to a job as ancient as walls, the stonemason's apprentice. Cathedrals, castles, these did not rise on their own. They were built stone by stone, under sun and rain, through injury and exhaustion. Master masons were respected, but apprentices? They were worked to the bone. They hauled stone blocks up scaffolds on their backs. They mixed lime mortar by foot. They carved intricate patterns while hunched for hours. Their work was precise, but brutal. Stone dust filled their eyes and lungs. Tools slipped. Hands bled. Heat stroke, broken bones, crushed fingers common. When winter came, the stones cracked. When summer came, the scaffolds blistered under the sun. It took years, decades, to climb from apprentice to journeyman. Some never made it. They died building something holy, something grand, but their names didn't go on the cornerstones. Only their sweat remained. Finally, for now, we look toward a job that combined labor, distance, and constant threat. The messenger. Medieval messengers were not postmen with leather bags and friendly waves. They were runners and riders who carried royal decrees, battlefield orders, or merchant instructions across dangerous terrain. They traveled alone. No roads, no inns, no protection. Their feet blistered, their horses collapsed. Robbers lay in wait. Bandits knew the value of a sealed letter. A single pouch could mean ransom, war, or inheritance. Messengers ran through rain, across snow, over mountains and rivers. If caught, they were tortured. If delayed, they were punished. If they lost the message, they were executed. They slept in stables, ate whatever they carried, bathed in rivers. If they were lucky, they were ignored. If not, they were killed for what they knew. And yet, kingdoms moved on their legs. Armies turned based on what they carried. Marriages and treaties, deaths and births all depended on their arrival. Their job left no monument, but they shaped every map. While kings and queens feasted in their halls, dancing and laughing beneath glittering chandeliers, there were those who lingered far from the splendor. These were not the entertainers or musicians who brought joy and music. They were the ones who cleaned away the aftermath. The forgotten laborers whose lives were spent in shadows and whose hands knew only hardship. Among these stood the rush floor cleaners. Medieval halls often had floors covered with rushes long, straw-like plants strewn over stone or earth to insulate against cold, damp, and dirt. On feast days, these rushes absorbed spilled ale, dropped food, animal waste, and worse. After celebrations ended, someone had to remove them. That someone was rarely seen, never praised, and always reviled. Rush floor cleaners spent their mornings raking up matted, rotting piles of straw mixed with grease, bones, discarded food, animal dung, and sometimes even human vomit. The floors beneath were slick with grime. Rats darted away as cleaners approached. Maggots wriggled in the oldest heaps. This task involved bending, scraping, shoveling, and carrying heavy baskets outside. Injuries were common cuts from broken pottery. Hidden beneath the rushes, bites from rodents disturbed from their nests. Infections quickly followed, as gloves were non-existent, and soap was expensive. Their pay was barely enough to buy bread, let alone treatment for infected wounds. They worked quickly, silently, and were replaced just as quietly if sickness overtook them. Yet without them, great halls would become uninhabitable within weeks, thick with stench and disease. Not far from these halls, another brutal job unfolded in gardens and fields. The night soil carrier dot. This profession, another polite medieval euphemism, was among the most universally despised. Night soil was human excrement, and it needed to be moved, often by the bucketful, from crowded towns to farmland beyond city walls. Carriers typically worked in darkness, loading buckets and carts filled with human waste collected from privies, alleyways, and cesspits. The stench was overwhelming. Gagging was constant. Disease thrived in this environment, carried by the flies that swarmed around carts and buckets. Workers wore rags across their faces to dull the smell, but nothing truly shielded them from the task dot in summer. The heat intensified odors, bringing dizziness and nausea. In winter, carts slipped and overturned in icy streets, spilling their contents. Carriers' shoes soaked in waste, their clothes permanently stained, their bodies weakened by illness and exhaustion. Townsfolk shunned them, refusing even casual greetings. Churches placed them at the back, if allowed inside at all dot, yet these carriers provided a critical service. Without them, towns and cities would have succumbed to disease outbreaks far more quickly. Their thankless work kept others healthy, even as their own health deteriorated rapidly, turning from the filth of streets to the isolation of the countryside. Let's visit another shadowy figure. The wild honey gatherer. Honey was crucial in medieval life, not just a sweetener, but medicine, preservative, and religious offering. Gathering wild honey, however, was dangerous and painful work. Hives were usually located high in trees, cliffsides, or deep within dense forests, places rarely visited and often dangerous to access. Gatherers climbed trees using ropes or crude ladders, balancing precariously as bees attacked relentlessly. Protective clothing was minimal, usually thin cloth wrapped around faces and hands. Stings covered their bodies, leaving painful welts and allergic reactions. Falls from trees or cliff edges resulted in broken limbs or death, yet the gatherers' family still depended on his harvest. Smoke was used to subdue bees temporarily, but fires often spread uncontrollably in dry forests, trapping gatherers or destroying the very hives they sought. Those who survived returned home swollen, blistered, and exhausted. Carrying precious honey, it was quickly sold for pennies not far from the sweetness they gathered. Their lives tasted of constant pain. Back within the walls of the medieval city, another group endured suffering for the sake of vanity: the mirror makers. Mirrors in the medieval period were not the clear, smooth glass surfaces we know today. They were rough metal discs, polished obsessively to achieve a dim reflection. The polishing process was brutal, involving abrasive powders made from pumice, sand, or powdered bones. Mirror makers spent their days grinding and buffing metal surfaces. By hand, hour after hour, in dim, dusty workshops. Their hands became raw and blistered, the skin on their fingers slowly worn away by constant friction. Dust particles filled their lungs, causing chronic coughs, respiratory diseases, and early death. Eyesight diminished rapidly from staring endlessly into reflective surfaces, distorted by poor light and crude tools. The chemical treatments used to prevent rust and corrosion included mercury and lead compounds. Prolonged exposure poisoned their bodies, causing tremors, confusion, and madness. Yet mirrors were highly prized possessions for nobility, merchants, and clergy. The mirror maker's suffering was invisible, reflecting back only the faintest, most distorted images of themselves. From reflection to warmth, we moved to another trade as dangerous as it was essential: the fire setter in mining operations. In medieval times was an agonizingly slow, brutal process. Digging into solid rock was impossible without help. Fire setting was the method used to weaken rock before miners chipped it away. Workers placed huge bonfires against the stone, heating it until it cracked, then doused it with cold water to shatter the rock. Fire setters were the ones responsible for maintaining these fires underground, breathing in dense smoke and scorching their skin daily. Air underground was scarce and choked with fumes. Fires often got out of control, leading to cave-ins or deadly gas pockets. Miners working alongside fire setters inhaled toxins that shortened their lives dramatically. Skin burns and permanent respiratory damage were commonplace. Workers rarely survived past middle age. When a tunnel collapsed, rescuers rarely rushed to help. Many believed miners and fire setters were cursed by spirits angry at the earth being disturbed. Yet, every cathedral stone, castle wall, and city gate depended on minerals mined this way. Nearby, in those same mines, another unseen worker performed an equally harsh task: the water bailer. In underground mines, flooding was constant. Water filled tunnels faster than miners could dig. To remove this constant threat, water bailers stood in cold, knee-deep pools underground, scooping buckets of water to pass upward along human chains. Hour after hour, day after day, bailers bent, scooped, lifted, and poured. Their hands and feet were perpetually numb from freezing water, their skin peeling and infected from constant moisture. If bailers paused, tunnels flooded quickly. Mines collapsed, drowning entire crews. The pressure was relentless. Even children joined the labor, forming lines to carry buckets overhead. Collapses and drownings were frequent. Few water bailers saw daylight regularly. Their bodies were permanently damaged, muscles twisted by repetitive motions, joints ruined by damp cold. They slept on stone floors underground, waking to resume work immediately. Their suffering remained hidden deep beneath the surface, known only by the echo of dripping water. Finally, let's move to the roads once more, this time to witness the hardship faced by medieval road menders. Roads in medieval Europe were notoriously poor muddy tracks, pitted with holes and churned by horses and carts. Road menders carried heavy stones and gravel, pouring them into deep ruts or puddles day after day. They crushed rock by hand, using heavy mallets, bending over for hours at a time. Back injuries and crushed fingers were common. Feet became misshapen from constantly standing on uneven surfaces. Dust from broken stone filled their lungs, causing painful coughs and breathing difficulties. Rain washed away their repairs constantly, forcing them to redo the same patches repeatedly. Robbers often targeted them, stealing tools or supplies. Villagers treated road menders as nuisances rather than helpers, often blaming them for poorly maintained routes. Despite their relentless toil, yet commerce and travel depended entirely upon their labors. Without them, medieval Europe's roads, poor as they were, would have been impassable altogether. In bustling medieval towns, behind the charming facades of inns and taverns, there existed hidden places where harsh realities overshadowed any festive atmosphere. These were the back rooms, cellars, and dark alleys inhabited by those whose livelihoods depended on suffering, both human and animal. One such figure was the cockfighting handler, a man whose life revolved around brutal contests for the entertainment of others. Cockfighting was a popular, though violent, pastime among medieval nobility and commoners alike. Handlers cared for fighting birds, bred for aggression, and trained to kill. These men endured constant risk, their bodies scarred by razor-sharp talons and beaks. Daily tasks included sharpening metal spurs attached to the bird's legs and forcing the animals to fight, often to the death, for spectators' amusement and betting. Handlers lived close to violence, routinely enduring injuries from frantic, panicked birds. Eye injuries and facial scars were common, and infected wounds from claws or beaks frequently led to debilitating illnesses. Additionally, gambling debts, cheating accusations, or suspicions of rigging fights often led handlers into dangerous confrontations with angry patrons or criminals. Yet, these handlers had few other options. Their brutal work ensured their own survival, while perpetuating a cycle of cruelty and bloodshed, hidden beneath society's thin veneer of festivity. From animal cruelty, we shift to another brutal and physically exhausting occupation, the wool. Fullers were essential to medieval cloth making, responsible for cleaning and thickening raw wool fabric. They stood knee-deep in large vats filled with a mixture of water, clay, urine, and acidic substances. Barefoot and exposed, they rhythmically stomped woolen cloth to remove grease, dirt, and impurities, a process known as fulling. The harsh chemicals burned their skin, causing chronic sores and infections, particularly around their legs and feet. The strong ammonia fumes irritated eyes and lungs, often causing respiratory diseases. The relentless stomping wore down their knees, ankles, and lower backs, leaving them prematurely crippled. Despite the essential nature of their work, fullers were widely shunned because of their constant smell of urine and chemicals. Yet every woolen cloak, shirt, or blanket depended entirely upon their painful labor, quietly performed out of sight. In a similar vein of unseen labor, medieval cities harbored another brutal occupation, the ink maker. Medieval manuscripts, charters, and records required vast quantities of ink. But the ink-making process was neither simple nor safe. Ink makers boiled iron salts, gallnuts, copperas, and oak bark, concocting solutions that emitted noxious fumes. These toxic vapors often caused severe headaches, respiratory disorders, and dizziness. Ink makers worked in dimly lit workshops, their hands perpetually stained black, fingers raw from handling caustic ingredients. Splashes from boiling ink caused painful burns that scarred permanently. Frequent contact with heavy metals, such as iron and copper, led to chronic poisoning, manifesting in tremors, memory loss, and hallucinations. Despite these severe health risks, ink makers receive little recognition or respect their contributions. Hidden behind the neatly scripted letters of monks and scribes, moving from quiet workshops to loud, dangerous construction sites, we find another occupation equally harsh: the pile driver operator got to build bridges, docks, or fortifications. Medieval engineers employed pile drivers, massive logs suspended by rope and pulley systems repeatedly, dropped onto wooden piles to drive them deep into the ground. Human operators controlled these primitive devices, pulling ropes endlessly to lift and release heavy logs, again and again, hour after hour. The labor was exhausting and perilous. Splintered wood and broken ropes posed constant hazards. Workers frequently suffered crushed limbs or severe fractures from mishaps. Long-term exposure to constant physical strain permanently damaged their muscles and joints. Their work environment was chaotic, noisy, and stressful. Accidents were frequent, and no safety measures existed. Yet without pile drivers, castles would sink, bridges collapse, and cities flood. Their strength literally supported civilization, even though society offered them nothing in return except broken bodies and short lives. In distant fields, another brutal, overlooked role existed: that of the bird scarer. Bird scarers had one simple but relentless task: keep crops safe by frightening away flocks of hungry birds, typically children or elderly adults. Bird scarers spent entire days wandering lonely fields, shouting, banging wooden clappers, or hurling stones to deter birds from devouring valuable grain or fruit. Their job required ceaseless vigilance, dawn until dusk, in all weather. Constant shouting damaged vocal cords, causing permanent hoarseness. Hours spent outdoors exposed them to harsh sunburns in summer and frostbite in winter. Their clothing offered little protection, and repeated exposure led to chronic illnesses. Isolation was perhaps their greatest hardship. Bird scarers worked alone, rarely socializing, often mocked as fools or oddities. Their mental health suffered greatly from solitude and monotony, their bodies exhausted from endless wandering. Yet their humble task prevented famine, safeguarding food for entire villages who rarely thanked or acknowledged their silent sacrifice. In a darker corner of medieval society, hidden among back alleys and slums, existed another brutal occupation: the leather scraper. Before leather reached the shoemaker or armor maker, hides needed cleaning, a job left to the lowest rung of workers. Leather scrapers scraped animal skins to remove hair, fat, and flesh. They soaked hides in vats filled with urine and lime, softening tissues for easier removal. The mixture caused painful chemical burns on hands, arms, and legs, while frequent cuts became infected from constant exposure to contaminated fluids. Scrapers endured the nauseating smell daily, their bodies permanently stained by the process. Diseases spread rapidly among workers crowded in filthy workshops. They often died young from infections, respiratory ailments, or blood poisoning. Yet replacements were easily found among the desperate and impoverished. Despite this brutal work, their lives remained invisible, their labor overshadowed by those who crafted finished leather goods, praised by society. Within city walls, another occupation involving constant hardship thrived: the bone picker. After feasts, battles, or market days, animal bones littered the streets. Bone pickers scavenged these remains, collecting them to sell to workshops, producing glue, broth, or fertilizer. They wandered alleys, garbage heaps, and battlefields, their hands bloodied from sharp bone fragments, their feet bruised by debris. Disease lurked everywhere, in rotting flesh, spoiled marrow, maggots. Pickers contracted infections regularly, often developing chronic illnesses. Their clothes stank perpetually, causing townsfolk to avoid them entirely. Bone pickers survived by selling bones for mere pennies, barely enough to stave off starvation. Despite their critical role in recycling waste, Society treated them as invisible, disposable shadows. Finally, we return to riversides and docks, encountering another brutally demanding trade, the barge hauler. Before steam power, medieval barges transporting heavy cargo relied on human strength. Barge haulers, men, or even young children, walked tirelessly along riverbanks, pulling barges upstream using ropes looped around their shoulders or waists. The ropes dug deeply into their flesh, leaving raw, infected sores. Their feet sank into mud, twisted on uneven terrain, or blistered and bled from sharp rocks. Collapsed lungs, hernias, and crushed ribs were common injuries from straining against heavy loads. Many barge haulers drowned, dragged underwater if ropes tangled or barges capsized. Exposure to elements caused chronic illnesses and shortened their lives drastically. Yet these brutal laborers enabled trade and commerce, transporting goods crucial for survival. Their sacrifice went unseen, their pain unacknowledged, their lives expendable. In each of these brutal occupations, cockfighting handlers, foolers, ink makers, pile drivers, bird scarers, leather scrapers, bone pickers, and barge haulers. The medieval world's survival rested silently on broken bodies, suffering in shadows, unrecognized yet indispensable. In medieval towns and villages, beneath bustling market squares and beside quiet country roads, a silent world of relentless hardship continued unnoticed. Every joy, every comfort enjoyed by the nobility or the merchant class was built upon hidden labor that stretched the limits of human endurance. Among these shadowy figures were the brickmakers. Brickmaking was a craft vital for medieval construction, yet extraordinarily brutal for those involved. Brickmakers toiled endlessly, mixing clay, sand, and water by hand or with their bare feet. The mixture was heavy, sticky, and unforgiving, causing severe muscular strain and exhaustion. After mixing, brickmakers pressed clay into wooden molds, their hands raw and blistered from repetitive friction. The molded bricks were dried outdoors, where sudden rains or frost could ruin weeks of labor overnight. Once dried, bricks were stacked into kilns and fired at blistering temperatures. Workers tended fires for days without rest, inhaling choking smoke and enduring constant risk from flames and collapsing kilns. Their lungs were ravaged by smoke inhalation, their skin permanently burned or scarred by falling embers. The pay was meager, barely enough to survive. Townspeople treated brickmakers as outcasts, associating their perpetual soot-covered faces and burned clothing with poverty or disgrace. Yet without their suffering, not a single medieval building, from modest houses to grand cathedrals, would stand. Leaving the brick kilns, we move toward another hidden corner of society, one involving constant physical torment, the grain porter. Grain was life in medieval Europe, essential food for survival, stored in massive quantities in warehouses or barns. Grain porters bore the punishing task of carrying enormous sacks filled with wheat, barley, or oats. Each sack weighed up to 100 pounds or more, balanced precariously across the porter's shoulders and back. Porters navigated narrow staircases, slippery ramps, and unstable ladders, each step threatening to collapse beneath their weight. Falls were frequent, causing severe injuries or death. Constant heavy lifting permanently deformed their spines, causing lifelong pain, disability, and early death. In summer months, porters sweated endlessly, their bodies dangerously dehydrated, their skin blistered from friction. In winter, their clothing froze against their skin, adding painful stiffness to already aching muscles. Respiratory diseases flourished from constant inhalation of grain dust, causing chronic coughs, asthma, and severe lung infections. Their exhausting labor fed entire towns, yet they received little gratitude or recognition. Their lives passed unnoticed, their suffering ignored, as sacks of grain steadily disappeared into bakeries and taverns. moving deeper into darkness. Another overlooked medieval occupation emerges: the execution site scavenger. When executions concluded, medieval crowds dispersed quickly, leaving behind gruesome scenes. Blood-soaked platforms, severed limbs, clothing, and belongings discarded by the condemned littered execution sites. Scavengers quickly appeared, sifting through this grim debris in hopes of finding valuables or reusable materials. Their task was morbid, carried out amid blood, flies, and stench. They searched through the mud, examining bodies hastily discarded in shallow pits or left exposed for birds. Injuries from sharp objects or bones hidden beneath debris were common, leading to infected wounds and lifelong scars. Execution scavengers lived as social pariahs, shunned by townsfolk and feared by children. Rumors of witchcraft or curses surrounded them, yet desperate poverty compelled them to continue. A single ring, coin, or scrap of clothing salvaged could mean the difference between life and starvation. Not far from these grim sights, another occupation, equally difficult and dangerous: unfolded candle snuffers. Before streetlights, medieval towns relied on candles and torches for illumination. Candles needed frequent trimming or snuffing to maintain steady light and prevent fires. Candle snuffers, often young boys or elderly men, wandered nightly through dark streets, climbing precarious ladders to reach lanterns hanging high above. Their job was treacherous. Falls from ladders onto stone streets frequently caused serious injuries or fatalities. Burning wax splattered their faces and hands, causing painful blisters and permanent scars. In winter, icy rungs on ladders made climbing particularly hazardous. Yet they worked relentlessly through storms and freezing nights. These men and boys received no recognition. Townsfolk passed by without acknowledgement, ignoring their burns, bruises, and broken bones. Yet, without their nightly vigilance, medieval towns would quickly descend into darkness, chaos, and danger. In the surrounding countryside, another laborious task unfolded quietly: the work of the ditch digger. Ditch diggers maintained irrigation canals, drainage ditches, and defensive trenches, endlessly cutting into earth, hardened by sun or frozen by frost. They dug with crude iron tools, their backs permanently bent, muscles straining from repetitive motions. Blisters covered their palms, which often became infected due to the constant exposure to dirt and contaminated water. Ditch digging involved constant risk. Collapses trapped workers beneath heavy soil, often crushing limbs or causing suffocation. In wet seasons, ditches flooded rapidly, drowning diggers unable to escape rising waters. Despite the danger, the work never ceased, vital for agriculture, sanitation, and town defenses. Ditch diggers lived isolated lives, rarely acknowledged, perpetually exhausted. Yet every medieval harvest, every flood prevented, and every invading army deterred relied upon their ceaseless effort. Lastly, we turn toward the lonely coastlines and harsh rocky shores, where the seaweed gatherer toiled. Seaweed gathering, though seemingly benign, was physically grueling and dangerous. Workers, often women and children, harvested seaweed by hand, wading waist-deep into freezing ocean waters. They balanced heavy baskets, filling them quickly while waves crashed around them. Slippery rocks caused frequent falls, resulting in broken bones or fatal drownings. Constant exposure to salt water caused painful, chronic skin conditions and joint inflammation. Workers developed arthritis at young ages, their hands permanently swollen and distorted. Seaweed harvesting continued year-round, even in winter storms, risking hypothermia or sudden death. Gathered seaweed provided fertilizer, medicine, and food supplements, indispensable to coastal communities. Despite their critical contributions, gatherers remained invisible, their lives consumed by endless waves, chilling winds, and relentless tides. These brutal medieval occupations, brickmakers, grain porters, execution scavengers, candle snuffers, ditch diggers, and seaweed gatherers exemplify the immense human cost beneath medieval society's facade. Their silent endurance allowed civilization to thrive, even as their own lives remained harsh, short, and tragically overlooked. Medieval life, often idealized through stories of knights, castles, and romance, concealed a harsh reality beneath its surface. Daily survival required people to undertake brutal, degrading tasks, often ignored or reviled by society. Far from the glamour of courts or the valor of battlefields, these forgotten laborers quietly endured lives filled with hardship, pain, and suffering. Among these overlooked figures was the ash burner. Ash burners produced potash by burning wood, creating a substance vital for soap making, glass production, and fertilizer. Their days began at dawn, gathering immense piles of logs and branches into carefully arranged heaps, then setting them ablaze. The fires had to be controlled precisely too hot, and valuable ash would vanish into smoke. Too cool and incomplete. Combustion would ruin days of effort. Workers inhaled smoke continuously, their lungs filled with choking soot. Their eyes watered constantly, becoming red and permanently damaged from exposure to heat and irritants. Ash burners suffered severe burns when flames leaped unpredictably, their clothes often catching fire. The job demanded round-the-clock vigilance, as fires required tending day and night. Workers barely slept, living beside their smoldering heaps, breathing acrid fumes while guarding against wind, rain, or theft. Despite their crucial contribution, ash burners were viewed as filthy, soot-covered outcasts. Their proximity brought stench and dirt, causing villagers to isolate them socially. Yet without their relentless labor, medieval industries would collapse overnight. Shifting from the smoke-filled forests to the icy riversides, we encounter the brutal life of the washerwoman. Washerwomen endured conditions few today could fathom. Every day, they dragged heavy baskets of clothing to freezing streams, ponds, or rivers. Kneeling for hours, they scrubbed garments against sharp rocks or wooden boards, their knuckles raw and bleeding from repeated friction. The harsh soaps, made from lye or animal fat, burned their hands, causing deep, painful cracks that rarely healed. In winter, washerwomen broke ice-covered water to wash clothing, their hands plunging into bitterly cold streams. Frostbite was common, often leading to permanent nerve damage or lost fingers. During summer, relentless heat caused dehydration and sunstroke. Washerwomen's backs and knees deteriorated rapidly, bent from continuous strain, permanently crippled. After years of repetitive labor, their work brought scant recognition. Families paid little for their services, yet expected immaculate laundry. Any flaw or stain could cost washerwomen their pay or reputation. Though integral to medieval cleanliness and health, washerwomen lived in constant poverty, unnoticed and unappreciated, moving beyond villages and into royal forests. Another perilous occupation unfolded: the gamekeeper's assistant. Gamekeepers protected royal or noble hunting grounds, ensuring game remained plentiful for aristocratic leisure. However, their assistants, often young boys or poor men, bore the brunt of physical labor and danger. They set and checked traps daily, their hands regularly caught in spring-loaded mechanisms, resulting in crushed fingers or broken bones. Assistants patrolled dark woods at night, alone and vulnerable to attacks by poachers or wild animals. Wolves, bears, and boars posed constant threats. Injuries were frequent, often deadly. Assistants faced severe punishment if game populations declined, blamed unfairly for circumstances beyond their control. Their lives were spent in fear and hardship, their bodies scarred by animal attacks and human cruelty alike. Yet they remained crucial, silently ensuring that the privileged few could continue their leisurely hunts undisturbed. Near bustling harbors. Another group faced continuous peril: the rope makers. Rope making was essential for maritime trade, agriculture, and construction. Yet the craft was brutally taxing. Workers twisted strands of hemp or flax fiber together manually, a physically demanding and repetitive task that permanently damaged wrists and shoulders. The rope walk: long, narrow spaces where ropes were constructed required workers to walk miles daily, continuously twisting and braiding fibers. Rope makers breathed dust and fibers, causing chronic respiratory diseases and severe allergies. Splinters embedded deeply beneath skin, leading to infections. Continuous exposure to abrasive materials permanently calloused hands, causing lifelong discomfort. Rope-making factories were frequently targets of fires due to volatile, flammable fibers, placing workers constantly at risk. Despite the critical role ropes played in medieval society, rope makers remained poor, overlooked figures, their labor unnoticed and their suffering unrecognized. Lastly, we examine another brutal medieval profession: the salt boiler. Salt was precious in medieval Europe, crucial for preserving food. Salt boilers labored near coastal evaporation pools or inland brine pits. Workers heated enormous iron pans over wood fires, continuously stirring boiling salt water. The process required relentless vigilance, ensuring pans never overheated or crystallized prematurely. Workers' skin blistered from splashing salt water, their eyes permanently damaged by salt fumes. Constant exposure dehydrated their bodies, causing dizziness and severe muscle cramps. The air in boiling houses became unbearably humid and caustic, weakening workers' lungs and hearts over time. Yet salt remained essential. Salt boilers lived short, harsh lives, invisible victims of society's unending demand for flavor and preservation. These brutal occupations: ash burners, washerwomen, gamekeepers' assistants, rope makers, and salt boilers, exemplify the hidden human cost behind medieval society's survival. Their quiet, unseen suffering built the foundation of civilization, though their lives remained tragically forgotten, lost within the very world they sustained. Within the stone-walled cities and quiet countryside of medieval Europe, life was built upon silent sacrifices. Behind every moment of comfort lay hidden labor, relentless, painful, and often invisible. Few noticed the hands and bodies that bore the brunt of daily survival, yet their hardships ensured entire communities could thrive. Among these unseen workers was the brewery laborer. Beer wasn't just a drink in medieval times. It was safer than water, essential for daily sustenance. Brewing, however, was brutally taxing. Laborers began before sunrise, hauling heavy sacks of grain to enormous vats. They crushed grain manually, their muscles aching from constant repetition, their skin raw from friction. Once ground, grain boiled in massive copper cauldrons. Brewery laborers stirred these boiling mixtures continuously, exposed to extreme heat, steam, and scalding splashes. Burns were frequent and severe, often permanently disfiguring hands and faces. A heavy humidity weakened lungs, leaving workers gasping for breath after each long day. Cleaning vats afterward involved dangerous chemicals, lye, or acidic cleansers, causing chemical burns and blisters. Slippery floors meant falls resulting in broken bones. Yet despite injuries, brewery laborers continued daily, providing the essential beer that medieval society depended upon for hydration and survival. Leaving breweries behind, another brutal role emerged quietly: the gut string maker. Medieval music relied on instruments strung with animal intestines: harps, lutes, and violins. Gut string makers transformed animal guts into musical strings, a disgusting and hazardous process. Workers stripped intestines by hand, using knives to remove mucus and fat. The foul smell was overwhelming, the slippery intestines difficult To manage dot workers suffered severe cuts from knives slipping in their slick hands, often becoming infected. Processing involved soaking guts in vats of urine and lye, chemicals burning skin and eyes. The fine threads required meticulous twisting, by hand, causing permanent cramps and chronic arthritis. Gut string makers frequently contracted illnesses from contaminated materials, shortening their already harsh lives. Though their labor allowed beautiful music to fill churches and castles, their lives remained hidden, marked only by hardship. And disease not far away, along medieval riverbanks, another harsh occupation flourished quietly: the reed cutter. Reed cutters harvested reeds used for roofing, flooring, baskets, and writing instruments. Yet this seemingly simple task was dangerous and exhausting. Workers waded into cold, muddy water, their feet sinking into unstable, marshy ground. Falls into hidden holes were frequent, causing injuries or drowning. Cold water exposure led to painful skin conditions, joint inflammation, and chronic rheumatism. Sharp reeds sliced deeply into skin, causing infections and chronic wounds. Reed cutters risked poisonous snakes, insects, and disease-bearing water. Their isolation, deep within marshes, left them vulnerable to robbery or animal attacks. Though reeds were essential, reed cutters endured poverty, pain, and social invisibility, their contributions quickly forgotten once bundles reached town markets. Within crowded medieval streets, another brutal job endured quietly: the lampblack maker. Lampblack was essential for inks, pigments, and cosmetics, produced by burning oils in closed vessels, collecting thick soot deposits afterward. Lampblack makers worked in dark, cramped rooms filled with smoke and soot. Workers inhaled toxic fumes continuously, causing severe respiratory damage, chronic coughing, and lung disease. Skin permanently blackened from soot exposure, their appearance frightful to townspeople who avoided them. Handling heated vessels meant constant risk of burns and severe injuries. Prolonged exposure to toxic compounds caused neurological symptoms, tremors, and confusion. Yet their suffering enabled monks to illuminate manuscripts and merchants too. Label goods, essential to medieval communication and trade. Finally, another silent suffering took place within medieval homes: the lives of chimney sweeps. Chimney sweeps, often young children or small men, climbed narrow chimneys daily, scraping away accumulated soot. The job was perilous. Workers frequently became stuck in tight passages, suffocating or dying alone and unnoticed. Burns from hidden embers or soot. Fires caused lifelong scarring. Constant soot inhalation damaged lungs irreparably, causing chronic illness and early death. Chimney sweeps faced severe cruelty, beaten by employers if deemed slow or careless. Society viewed them as disposable, easily replaced when injury or illness claimed their lives. Yet every medieval hearth depended on their labor, their sacrifices. Went unseen, their pain hidden within walls they kept safe. These brutally demanding jobs: brewery laborers, gut string makers, reed cutters, lampblack makers, and chimney sweeps quietly shaped medieval society. Behind castles, churches, music, and warmth lay immense human cost, endured silently and forgotten swiftly by the world they helped sustain. As we arrive at the final stretch of this dark journey through medieval labor, we return once more to the foundation of life in that era: survival. Not survival in the romantic sense knights saving kingdoms, peasants cheerfully sowing fields, but the raw, unrelenting effort to stay alive when almost everything was against you. In this world, survival was a task in itself, and some jobs embodied that better than any other. One of the most brutal was also the most tragically ironic: the plague cleaner. When the Black Death swept through Europe in waves, from the 14th century onward, cities became graveyards. Homes were sealed with their inhabitants still inside. Entire streets went silent. Trade stopped. Clergy died. Doctors fled. And in the vacuum left behind came a class of workers who were neither respected nor remembered, the ones who had to clean up what remained. Plague cleaners were hired to enter infected homes, drag out the bodies, remove soiled bedding, tear up bloodstained floors, burn clothing, and cart off any possessions that hadn't already been stolen. They did all this while breathing the same air, walking the same rooms, and touching the same skin that had only hours before belonged to the dead. They covered themselves in vinegar-soaked rags, stuffed herbs in their mouths, and prayed quietly, with every breath. But none of it was enough. Many lasted only days. Some knew they wouldn't make it to the end of the week, and yet they came back, again and again, for one more job. One more house. They weren't martyrs. They weren't brave. They were poor, and they needed coin. When everyone else turned away, they stepped forward not out of courage, but out of hunger. From plague houses, we turned to another grim duty. The bell ringer during death tolls and storms. Church bells were not merely for marking time. They rang to signal danger, disaster, or mourning. In times of plague, bells tolled constantly, announcing death after death. But someone had to climb the stairs and pull the rope often for hours. In tall steeples, bell ringers climbed rickety wooden ladders into wind-blown towers. During storms, lightning frequently struck spires. Ringing a bell while standing next to a metal chain in a tall structure made the ringer a living lightning rod. Many were killed outright, their charred bodies found near blackened beams. Others fell from great heights, the strain of hauling massive. Bells wore down shoulders, backs, and arms. Some went deaf from the repeated shockwaves of sound within enclosed stone towers. Yet the bells had to be rung. For plague, for fire, for war. The world listened. The ringer paid the price. Another lesser-known role was that of the bloodletter's apprentice. Bloodletting was the dominant form of medicine throughout much of the Middle Ages. Barbers and physicians alike used knives, leeches, and cups to remove what they believed were harmful humors from the body. But the actual work of managing this process, the dirty, dangerous part, fell to the apprentices. Apprentices prepared tools, cleaned up after patients fainted or vomited, and collected leeches from bogs. They sliced patients' arms, ankles, or necks on command. They held screaming men still. They drained pints of blood from sick children. And they often did it incorrectly. When things went wrong, and they frequently did, it was the apprentice who was beaten, blamed, or dismissed. Many were bitten by infected leeches. Some developed septicemia from frequent exposure to blood. They learned medicine, yes, but by surviving it, not studying it. And in time, they either died or became masters themselves. In the freezing winter months, another haunting trade emerged from the water: the ice cutter. Before refrigeration, ice was harvested naturally from frozen lakes and rivers, stored in insulated pits and cellars to cool food, preserve meat, or provide comfort to the wealthy in summer. Ice cutters waded into frozen lakes, breaking through the surface with heavy axes and saws. They worked in biting winds, their hands stiff and purple, their feet soaked despite straw-wrapped boots. The ice cracked beneath them as they hauled massive, slick blocks onto sledges. Many fell in. Some vanished beneath the ice, never found. Until thaw, others suffered frostbite, losing toes, fingers, or entire limbs. There was no safety gear, no help if something went wrong. Just men with blades and ropes, balancing on death. The ice was carted away and sold to nobles, stored in deep wells, turned into luxury. The men who cut it lived in poverty, coughing through every spring, waiting for the next winter to start. Again, on the opposite end of heat and hardship were the lime kiln workers, who baked limestone into quicklime used for mortar, sanitation, and even warfare. The kilns burned day and night, reaching temperatures high enough to melt flesh. Workers added fuel constantly, hauling logs and stoking fires while being surrounded by searing air and acrid fumes. Accidental collapses of the kill walls or explosions from gas pockets were common. The lime dust, once inhaled, caused severe lung damage. Quicklime, when it contacted moist skin, created chemical burns. Many lost their eyesight from dust exposure alone. They worked shirtless in the heat, skin peeling and blackened. No protection, no compensation. Only the knowledge that if they stopped, walls would crumble, churches would collapse, and war machines would fail. Back in cities, another horrific occupation was the rat pelt skinner. When rats became too numerous, authorities offered coin for tails, proof of each rodent killed. Some took this to the next level, collecting full bodies and skinning them for fur. Rats were caught with traps, clubs, or bare hands. The risk of bites was constant. Fleas carried plague. The filth was unimaginable. But the pelts stripped, stretched, and cured were sold for lining gloves or making crude hats. Skinning required care. A single slip meant slicing your own fingers. Open. Infections were immediate, as rat blood carried disease. Pelts had to be soaked in lye to kill parasites, causing burns and breathing trouble. Rat skinners worked alone. No one welcomed them. No one looked them in the eye. They lived on the edge of survival, profiting from death, hunted by the same creatures they hunted. Not far removed were the corpse watchers, a job sometimes filled by women, widows, or poor. Men paid a pittance to sit overnight with the dead. Superstition ruled the medieval mind. A corpse left unwatched could become possessed. It could rise. It could be stolen for dark purposes. And so, a watcher would sit sometimes for days with a candle and prayer book, keeping vigil. The rooms were cold, the air thick. Decomposition began fast. Bodies leaked, shifted, twitched. Some watchers went mad, hallucinating from lack of sleep and the smell of rot. They sat in silence, surrounded by darkness, listening to the creak of boards and the scratch of rats in the walls, wondering if the dead would stay dead. Few stayed in the job long. Those who did aged fast in coastal towns. Another savage task fell to the fish garbler, a job focused on sorting, cleaning, and sometimes salvaging half-rotten catches hauled in from the sea. Garbled fish were gutted, scraped, and cleaned by hand. Maggots were a common sight. Salt was rubbed into wounds, both the fishes and the workers. Gills and bones sliced fingers deeply. Cleaning knives slipped in the cold. Jellyfish stings, crab bites, and sea lice were routine. The smell followed them always. They were refused entry into churches, taverns, and homes. Some lived in boats, others in damp shacks that reeked worse than their workplaces. But without them, there would be no trade, no salted cod, no dried herring, no income for the townsfolk who mocked them. Let us end where it all begins, the birth of the next generation and end. The medieval midwife. Midwifery was one of the most difficult, emotionally brutal jobs imaginable. Women labored for days, screamed, bled, died. Babies were born lifeless. Others were malformed. In most villages, the midwife was the only person with knowledge of childbirth, herbs, or even anatomy. She worked by candlelight, with no tools but her hands, a blade, and prayer. She was blamed for stillbirths, accused of witchcraft, or shunned when things went wrong. If a noble child died, she might be imprisoned or executed. Midwives witnessed more death than any soldier. They carried women's blood under their fingernails for a lifetime. And still, the village called her when the pain began. She walked through snow and mud to arrive in time. She buried more children than she birthed. And she did it over and over because no one else would. And so, we conclude, These were not stories of glory or greatness, not tales of heroism or holy virtue. These were stories of necessity of men and women whose lives were given not to legacy, but to labor. They lifted stones, skinned rats, burned lime, pulled rope, and watched the dead so others didn't have to. The medieval world was brutal, not only in its wars and laws, but in its work. Behind every carved cathedral and noble banquet was a broken back, a cut hand, a silent scream. Their names were not written down, but their sweat still soaks the soil. And now, at last, their stories have been heard. Good night,